Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists for today. First, we have Mr. Todd McFarland, who's the Deputy General Counsel for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Dr. Lawrence Brown, who's the Senior Pastor of the Queensboro Seventh-day Adventist Church in New York City. We have Ms. Jennifer Woods, who's the General Counsel and Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Lake Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we have Ms. Melissa Reed, who's the Director of Government Affairs for the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Ladies and gentlemen, good having you here with us and looking forward to our conversation. You know, there's a concept out there that's called the Coreligionist Exemption. And we had a Jewish group and an Islamic advocacy team that weighed in on a Catholic school's challenge of a Michigan anti-discrimination law that was calling for religious liberty protections to be upheld by an appeals court in the hearing of this particular case. You know, back in 2022, the Michigan Supreme Court ruled that sexual orientation and gender identity were protected categories under the 1976 Michigan anti-discrimination statute. However, the Sacred Heart of Jesus Parish has a school, the Sacred Heart Academy, and they filed a lawsuit last December that was really arguing that the new interpretation of law would require schools to impose strict policies and practices and enforcing non-Catholic views of sexual orientation and gender identity. This seems to be an issue that starts to find itself permeating throughout many parts of the United States. And one of the things that we're trying to figure out is how do you find the right balance? On one hand, you want to be in a position where you're protecting certain speech, but on the other hand, you want to allow religious organizations to move forward and to kind of determine which way they should go. When you hear this particular topic, what do you guys think and how would you get involved in something or even give a better understanding of what this is all about?
Well, first of all, when I was reviewing this case, the question I asked, and I noticed it was dismissed for lack of standing, the question I asked, were they filing the case because they thought they legitimately had something to worry about? Or did they file the case because they were just trying to, poke the bear, so to speak? Because over and over again, the court seems to have come down on the side of allowing religious organizations to be able to maintain their beliefs. In other words, hire people that teach what we believe. And in our being there system, if you sign up to go to school there, then it's understood that these are the practices that you're going to follow. So in light of that, I found it a little curious that the case had been filed the way it was. And that's why I began this by saying, or by asking, were they filing the motion because they were really worried about something? Or were they filing it because they were just trying to make a point or begin a conversation? Because religious schools typically are allowed to maintain their belief system, and that's why people send their children there in the first place.
Well, I think the irony of this case, and one of the things that comes up, is that the Attorney General did not come back and issue any warnings afterwards. This case ended up getting kicked out, and the thought process is that as we look at this co-religionist exemption, that there may need to be some type of quote-unquote follow-up from a dialogue standpoint or even a policy standpoint regarding where any of this may go. When you think about where this could go and how you try to nip it in the bud, I think that's the real concern that we're trying to get a handle on, and understanding what might be the next step, or how do you prevent a negative next step from happening? What are your thoughts regarding that?
So, religious schools and religious institutions absolutely have to have the right to employ people that are consistent with their beliefs and also teach and conduct their school the way that they, according to their beliefs. That's the whole point of having, Christian or religious schools, which the U.S. Supreme Court has protected. The U.S. Supreme Court has said back in the early 20th centuries, parents have the right to send their kids to a parochial school or other school and not send them to the public school. You can't require them to send their kids to a public school. And so the government shouldn't be able to get around that requirement by then just turning every private school into a public school. So, getting to Dr. Brown's question about whether or not this was filed in good faith, I would tend to think it was. when a state passes a law and it has these broad meanings, it is perfectly reasonable to assume it's going to apply to you. What often happens in these situations is the government at that point, often understands, oh, well, you're reading at that, and then they back off in the litigation. But if the state of Michigan had passed a law that narrowly excluded these, communities of faith, I don't think they would have been facing down a lawsuit.
What I find interesting here is that, regardless of the underlying lawsuit that was filed by the Catholic school, you have these two groups, the Jewish group and the Islamic advocacy team, coming together saying, hey, we want to make sure that we address this one issue. They don't address the case as a whole. They say, we want to talk about the Coreligionist Exemption, right? Or the protections there, because it's so important, especially to minority religions, to make sure that this is in place, because it serves the interest of making sure that religious organizations' determinations as far as who they hire and their roles are deferred to and aren't second-guessed or questioned by others outside of that group. And so I thought it was interesting that they thought that there was enough of a concern here that they filed an amicus brief to make sure that this issue would be looked at or would be addressed.
Yeah, going back to Dr. Brown's question as far as, the motivation for the lawsuit, I think absolutely, as Todd said, there's the federal protections currently for religious employers, religious schools, as far as hiring practices and teaching of mission and things like that. However, we are seeing this happen. Michigan is not the only state to be sort of challenging that. So our offices, the headquarters of the Seventh Adventist Church, are located in Maryland, and we are experiencing that same situation in this legislative session. A bill was introduced that basically was saying that individuals who are, quote, non-essential employees do not have to, are not, or should not be required to follow the missions or the teachings of the school or practice those. And so we joined other religious organizations to push back against that and say, absolutely not. Again, these federal protections exist, and they have for decades for a reason. Again, the reason for the school's existence, the reason that parents are sacrificing to be able to send their children to these schools is because exactly of the alignment with the mission or the faith of the religion.
Todd, when you see a situation like this where you see that they were basically kicked out for lack of standing, when we think about that concept, how did the lack of standing piece kind of play into this? And do you think that was the right decision on their part?
Well, so standing is one of those, legal concepts that I think drives lay people crazy because it's like, well, listen, I would like a decision, but courts often use to dodge an issue. It just simply means is, do you have the ability to challenge this? Do you have any skin in the game would be sort of a colloquial way of putting it. I'm not going to opine whether the Sixth Circuit got this right or not. I think they were just simply trying to avoid it. If ultimately the state of Michigan and private parties never try to enforce this law, then I think, yeah, Sacred Heart probably didn't have standing. And so if the lawsuit has that effect, then that's great. But what's going to happen is at some point some of this will be enforced against and they'll be able to challenge it then. But you don't want to wait until you get sued or you get charged. Oftentimes people want clarity about what the law is ahead of time so they know what kind of risks they're taking.
Right.
It seems as though there are certain hot button issues that guarantee somewhere along the line there's going to be a bumping of heads. And these issues dealing with sexuality, these issues dealing with, the hot button issues that people love to fight about today, they just seem tailor-made for conflict. You would think that there's enough of a clear line, a clear standard that there would be settled issues. But obviously that is not the case. And I think on both sides of the argument, you have people chomping for a fight because they just want to see either the protections expanded or the liberties expanded. And so the concept of everyone being happy where they are, yeah, I guess that doesn't even exist. So fights in these forums and other similar forums It's probably going to be the order of the day for the next little bit, because no one's going to be happy with things sitting where they are.
So as someone that represents a minority faith tradition, I really appreciate that these two other faith organizations wanted to affirm the right of this Catholic school, right? And I think that's exactly what we're called to do, is stand up for the rights of others. And again, as Tom was saying, I think that it makes a lot of sense that the lawsuit was filed, because we don't want to wait, a small school, and I'm thinking, the Seventh-day Adventist Church and our, very small schools in some situations, one or two teachers in a situation. We don't want to wait until there's an issue and they're being sued.
Right.
We want to see the clarity, have that clarity and make sure that those protections exist when these new laws on state level laws come in that includes the sexual orientation and gender identity as part of protected non-discrimination clauses.
I remember, getting calls and questions when, the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act, which is the act in Michigan, when they expanded the categories, right? The questions came in, well, how does this impact us? And as Todd said, if there was an exemption in the law that said it doesn't apply to religious organizations, that would have cleared this up. But there was no language there. And so this vagueness as to how it would impact our institutions and our schools in particular, I think that, clarity is needed, because people do want to know where they're standing on all of this.
So therein lies the rub, because here in New York, when certain things were done, I know that language protecting, certain religious organizations was bundled in, especially when it came to this whole issue of same-sex marriage. So I'm a little surprised that for such a hot button issue that somebody wouldn't have had the presence of mind to include that language in there, especially since you're guaranteed a fight if, this goes the wrong way.
Yeah, there was not a lack of thinking about it, right? What we've seen is this trend of early sort of blue states, right? California, New York, and so forth. When they passed their laws, they knew they had to put religious liberty exemptions, and they did. What you see is these purplish states, which Michigan is the poster child for. Once they sort of go blue, now putting in religious exemptions is considered, no good. You don't do that. And it's a matter of timing, but it absolutely was not an oversight.
I'm gonna have to let that be the last word on it, but I think you're making that point that we're trying to figure out blue states, red states, purple states, when you come forward with things, and that's what we're gonna see probably more happening even in the future. It's a court case called the Oklahoma Statewide Virtual Charter School Board, Inc. versus the Statewide Virtual Charter School Board. And the approval of taxpayer funding for the nation's first religious public charter school has pretty much split Oklahoma officials and the religious liberty advocacy groups over the constitutionality of this particular situation. We've got a couple of lawsuits that are seeking to block the creation of this particular virtual school, which is a joint venture between the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City and the Diocese of Tulsa, that's designed to provide innovative educational options for the underserved populations, especially students in rural areas. Jennifer, we're seeing that we've got a real unique situation here. We've got a charter school that has this religious connotations, and we're gotten to a point now where every moment we seem like we're getting closer and closer to the question of when have these two things come together in a way that it's no longer workable. And it looks like this case is almost like splitting Oklahoma in half. The advocacy groups for religion don't know what to do. The education people don't know what to do. But some people think that a religious charter school might be a good idea. When you take a look at this, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this is such a unique situation because as I heard about this, I'm saying, how can this be? This is a public school, right? And this is one of the suits that was filed by parents and faith leaders. They're saying this is against the state constitution, right? The Oklahoma state constitution says that public schools are to be free from sectarian control, and also the state statute says that charter schools are not supposed to be sectarian. This seems like it's a clear violation of that, right? This is a Catholic school. They will be upholding Catholic values in the school. They're going to have people sign on to following the handbook that might have religious aspects to it. And so I find it a really hard stretch to say that this is not a religious school or a sectarian school. I don't see how one can say that it's not violating the Constitution to have a school like this in existence, paid for with public funds.
I think an answer to that is, and I think what they were arguing is the Supreme Court has also said in Carson versus Macon, which was a case coming out of Maine a couple of years ago, like maybe even last year, said, listen, if the state is providing benefits to private secular schools, they also have to provide it to religious schools. Now that case, if you think that this case was unique, Maine was even more unique because Maine, because it's a sparsely populated state, has something called town tuitioning. And what they will do is they will actually pay for a student to go to any school, well, it was any private school that wasn't religious that they wanted to. And so I think there's that line, right? Like we don't want public schools to be overtly religious, but yet if they're providing funding to a private school, as long as they're not religious, then is that really acceptable? And charter schools have historically been private or public schools, right? They're run separately. They don't go through the regular Board of Education, but they have been historically a public school. And I think that the argument they were trying to make was, well, listen, this is more like supporting, like in Carson, a private school. It's virtual. People can join from anywhere around the state. But there's a lot to be worried about. And I think, you know, we've talked in some other and different episodes, hopefully our viewers watch all of them, about situations where states have opened up like public places for displays, and then they're upset when the Satanists come in. And so this, what the state of Oklahoma asked itself is, are you comfortable with not just a Catholic public charter school, but all other faiths as well, including faiths that you don't agree with, like, you know, running an Islamic school, a madrasa? Would that be something you would be comfortable with? And so I think it is, we are probably better off in keeping our public schools and our private schools separate, though on the funding issue, if they are going to be funding private schools, they shouldn't be allowed to discriminate against religious private schools.
You know, it's interesting contrasting this situation with the one we just discussed in the first segment, right? Where we had, in the first segment, we had a private school, religious school that was, you know, sort of quote unquote following the rules. And now we have a situation where it seems like, again, and I think this is because of the ruling in Carson, we're seeing a religious school try to sort of see, well, how far can we go with this sort of new standard? And I think that as people of faith, we need to act in good faith, pun intended, right? Like, I think that if we want the ability as to be able to have our hiring, you know, practices and hiring standards, be able to teach, you know, our religious mission and things like that, require, you know, standards from our students, then we need to stay in that separate sphere, in that private sphere. And as Jennifer said, this is a clear violation of not even just like federal legislation or law. This is of the Oklahoma Constitution as well. So it's interesting. It seems like there was someone who, on their way out of the office, made, you know, this was their parting shot, the former Oklahoma Attorney General. You know, now there are two lawsuits against this, one of them being the current Oklahoma Attorney General. So I will be very surprised to see if this stands.
Lawrence, I see the heartburn burning through the screen when you hear this. Tell us what your thoughts are on that.
So I'm going to tell you what's annoying me about this. This is another example of the kind of what I call creep that we've been seeing. You know, there was a time when you had certain norms that were well established, and that's where it's set. So for this to have become even this close to being a thing, it's troubling. Over and over again, we're watching what used to be considered good government. We're watching what used to be considered an appropriate way to handle things. We're watching those things get tossed out windows left and right. And all of a sudden, it's like half the country suddenly got Alzheimer's and forgot that there's just certain things that are how they are for a reason. And I'm hopeful that this will be resolved in a way that removes it as an issue. But we shouldn't even be here. I mean, the fact that a place like Oklahoma could have enough people that even remotely thought this was a good idea for it to have gained the kind of traction that it gained says to me, we're not paying attention. And there's too much. Some of it may be accidentally, some of it may be purposefully, but there's too much of tossing of principles and best practices. And I don't know how people think this is a good way to operate. But at the end of the day, when these things keep getting tossed and then we end up with a hot mess, then what's going to happen is folks like, oh, well, how do we get here? Oh, how do we get here? Really? I think it's kind of clear how we got here. There's too much creep happening, and it's a problem.
But Todd, isn't a whole lot of this about the fact that, we're in Washington, you're in New York, you're in Michigan, and if we were in Oklahoma, we may completely understand why this is taking place. I mean, this could be a situation where based on resources, based on what that type of organization has been doing in their community and in their state for quite some time. On one hand, somebody in this legislative body came up with this idea, and I can't imagine they didn't understand that it was going to be engaging in the creep. And let me be careful, I'm uncomfortable with the creep as well, because who knows where this goes, but in the same breath, I don't have to quote unquote walk in their moccasins in Oklahoma and maybe I will never understand. I mean, Todd, am I missing something here with that?
Yeah, I first of all, I think, with all due respect to Dr. Brown, I think he does understand the demographics of Oklahoma and probably is not as surprised that there were the people in support there, right? This is a demographic that, listen, we're Christian. This is we elect these leaders. This is our tax dollars. Why can't we spend them the way we want? And there are limits to that. And I wish that the electorate, and not just Oklahoma, but around the country, because it's just as bad in the blue states as well, understood that, we need to use our tax dollars in our government for everybody and not just who happens to be in power at the time. And the challenge is, and this is where I think it gets, is that, everyone talks about, especially the people who are opposed to this, it's not like the public schools themselves are neutral on religion. When you push religion completely out of a school, you don't talk about it as a motivating factor in your classes, you don't do anything. That is a form of religious expression itself. It's a form of secularism, right? And so truly staying neutral in a school context on the issue of religion is almost impossible, because by ignoring it, which is what the public schools have done since the 1960s, and prayer in schools was found unconstitutional, is just to ignore it. And that's not neutral either. And so somewhere schools need to recognize the existence of religion, allow people to practice their faith, but yet not turn themselves into an arm of the local Baptist church.
Yeah, guys, here's the thing, though. In this particular case, this isn't a school with religious gloss. This isn't a school with, religious underpinnings. This is a situation where they've said to the Catholic school, take the wheel, have at it. And that's a problem. It's a problem. If there's a problem to solve, if there's an issue with access to education, then why didn't they just start a remote public school or a remote virtual school? Why did you have to go and essentially say, guys, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee? That's a problem.
I agree that it's important that we pay attention to what's happening, particularly in these state level situations, and the creep that we are seeing, I think, in both directions. Again, depending on the state, right?
Yep.
As far as what the state legislation is friendly to, and we're seeing that testing occur all across the country. One reason that I am heartened is because, yes, Oklahoma is a red state, and the majority of the population there are devout Christian. However, it really does seem to me, in the reading that I did, that this was kind of a one-off by this former attorney general. We have the current governor, a Republican, and the current attorney general, who is a Republican, saying absolutely not. This is not. So I don't, I'm heartened by that. Again, recognizing, no, this is a bridge too far.
It is ironic, though. Remember, Oklahoma is a state that has a Blaine Amendment, which were passed in the early 20th centuries, which were designed solely to keep out Catholic schools. So the fact that Catholic school now is something that the state is embracing It may not be standing up for religious freedom, but it does show where we've gone in society about who the bugaboos are and where the biases sort of land.
The thing that is interesting to me, and I think you touched on it earlier, Melissa, is that between these two segments, we're looking at the First Amendment, right? Like we're looking at the free exercise clause applying to religious institutions that say, hey, let us do our thing without you coming in and trying to dictate how we run our religious institutions. And then in this case, it's this establishment issue, right? Is the state here establishing religion or endorsing religion by funding a Catholic charter school with taxpayer dollars that's supposed to be a public school?
Well, I tell you, some of these issues look like they're clear on its face, but because we see the battles that are happening in different parts of the United States, I think this is a quagmire we're going to be talking about for quite some time. Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
Okay, Orlin, so today we've been talking about the Catholic school system. Did you know, Orlin, that the second largest parochial school system, the Catholic being the first, is in fact run by the Seventh-day Adventist Church?
May have heard that before. Jennifer, tell me something I don't know.
Sure. Since we were talking about Michigan, I don't know if you know this, but Michigan is the only state to have a highway that prohibits cars and other motorized vehicles.
No, I did not know that. Todd, tell me something I don't know.
A few years ago, when the state of Michigan resolved a lawsuit, which the Adventist Church participated in, providing kosher and halal meals to prisoners in the Department of Corrections, they did it by providing a soy-based diet. What's interesting about that is the number of prisoners that wrote into the judge complaining about soy-based diets generally. But the state of Michigan did do the right thing and provided those halal and kosher meals.
Thanks a lot on that one. Lawrence, tell me something I don't know.
Oklahoma has 165 religious schools serving almost 34,000 students. So if you want your child to go to church school, pick one of those.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for that conversation today and learned a lot of great things. And thank you again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith in politics. See you next time.